Hey friends, welcome back to MysteryCon. Today I'll be guiding you through a series of stories that explore the awakening of hidden alien forces emerging through the Earth, our DNA, the ocean depths, and advanced technology. As these signals spread, humanity begins to transform, becoming part of something far greater. Before we begin, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share where you're tuning in from. Let's begin. I knew the land like I knew the lines in my own hands, but nothing could have prepared me for what we struck beneath the North Field. It started mid-April, just after the first good thaw. I'd hired a crew to dig an irrigation trench down by the old windbreak. The topsoil was still damp, dark as coffee grounds, and we were cutting deep, about 5 feet when it happened. The backhoe let out a grinding groan, then stopped cold. Not stalled. Hit something. Thought it was rock at first, maybe glacial granite, but the bucket scraped off it clean. Too clean. When I stepped down into the trench, what I saw made my skin tighten. It wasn't stone, it was a slab, flat, pale and seamless. No tool marks, no imperfections, just a smooth, featureless surface like poured glass, frozen in a perfect sheet. It made no sense. This wasn't bedrock. We weren't anywhere near limestone shelves or buried foundations. I ran my palm across it. Cold as ice. Even in sunlight. We tried to dig around it, but gave up after 6 feet. It didn't end. That night, I sat in my kitchen staring at the satellite images I pulled from the Ag Extension site. The field looked normal, but that slab wasn't natural and it wasn't small. Next morning, I called in a buddy from the county university. Said he could bring ground-penetrating radar. Figured we'd see old well pipes or a sinkhole. What we found was worse. Beneath the field, just under 20 feet down, was a hollow chamber the size of a grain elevator. Dead center, with a single object inside. A sealed structure, egg-shaped, pulsing faintly with heat signatures. No known metal, no access points. But something was humming down there. Not mechanical, resonant, alive. I haven't told the crew. Told them we hit a utility vault and needed to pause. But something about it, it's in my head now, that hum. It's not just under my land. I hear it in my sleep, in the wind through the corn, like whatever's down there knows it's been found. The GPR team came back 2 days later with better equipment, high-frequency radar arrays meant for deep soil analysis. I told them it was an agricultural study, part of a crop yield optimization trial. Technically not a lie, given what started happening in the field. The readings came through clean, too clean. The underground chamber wasn't just a cavern, it had shape, symmetry, a near-perfect ellipse with internal structures. One was the source of the heat signature. The other looked like scaffolding or ribs, some kind of framework around it. There were no fractures in the surrounding soil, no signs of collapse, no water intrusion. It was as if the earth had formed around this thing without disturbing it. I sent the crew home for the weekend, said I needed time to review data. In truth, I just wanted to be alone with the land. That's when I noticed the corn. I hadn't planted yet. The field was bare a week ago, but 3 neat rows had sprouted in a tight arc just above the chamber. No one had touched that soil. The pattern didn't match anything I'd seeded last season, and it wasn't just the growth, it was the speed. In 2 days, the shoots were nearly 6 inches tall, vibrant, too green for April. The ground around them was warmer than the rest of the field. I checked it with a soil probe. It read 84 degrees. I ran a test patch for comparison, normal germination. Nothing strange, but these sprouts above the slab pulsed faintly in the moonlight, like they were drawing something from below. That night I sat out on the back steps, watching the wind move through the grass. Then the sky shifted. It wasn't a storm. There were no clouds, but the air felt thick, charged. A stillness rolled in, unnatural, like the world was paused. Then the corn bent, all at once, in a perfect spiral, curling clockwise as if responding to a signal. I didn't sleep. I just stared out at the pattern, knowing it wasn't random. It was a message. Or maybe a mechanism. Whatever we'd uncovered wasn't just buried, it was waiting. And now something inside it had begun to stir. By Monday morning, the crop rows had doubled, not just in size. Something about them felt different. Their stalks were too rigid, almost glassy, and their leaves had a faint metallic sheen under direct light. I clipped a few samples and sent them to the extension lab under a colleague's name. Said they came from an experimental greenhouse. No need to raise questions. That afternoon, the university team returned. They'd picked up something new on the deep scan. Vibration readings. Not seismic, not natural. A low-frequency pulse, cycling every 4 seconds, originating directly from the chamber. They were excited. Said it could be geothermal or even magnetic resonance. But I knew better. This wasn't geological, it was deliberate. That night I set up a field recorder, one of those old parabolic mics I used to track coyote movements during calving season. I pointed it toward the center of the field, then left it running from sundown to sunrise. When I played it back, the sound was there, buried under the ambient noise. A low, rhythmic thrum. Faint, almost imperceptible, but constant. I looped. It slowed it down. There were fluctuations, not random, patterns, like the repetition of breath or a heartbeat stretched across hours. I stayed up all night listening to it, headphones on, the volume low. Around 3 a.m., I noticed the animals. My neighbor's cattle, almost a mile away, began lowing in unison. The coyotes were silent. Even the frogs by the creek held still. Total unnatural quiet, like the land itself had gone mute. Then the dogs started barking, high-pitched, agitated, not at anything visible, just toward the ground, toward the slab. The hum grew stronger, not in volume, but in weight. I could feel it in my chest, a steady pressure behind the sternum, like a tuning fork held just out of reach. It wasn't sound anymore. It was a presence. I shut off the recorder, but it didn't matter. The hum was in the soil now, in the walls, in the marrow of my bones. That night I dreamed of roots, deep black tendrils growing upward from a hollow beneath the earth. They weren't reaching, they were listening. By midweek, the field had changed. The growth wasn't limited to the sprouted rows anymore. Small, clusters of plant life, dense, vine-like shoots with wide, glossy leaves, were pushing through the topsoil in a perfect spiral, mirroring the shape I'd seen in the corn. I hadn't planted anything like it. No weed in Iowa grows in that configuration, and none that I know glows faintly under moonlight. I tried cutting one open. The stem oozed a translucent gel that hardened within seconds. My hands tingled. Hours afterward, I told no one. The university team hadn't returned, and I didn't follow up. I wasn't sure I wanted them back. Whatever this was, it was spreading, and I needed to know if it would stop on its own. It didn't. The weather turned odd next. Isolated thunderstorms that hovered directly over the north field, never drifting, never following the radar models. I'd stand at the edge of my porch and watch the sky pour rain onto a single patch of land, while the rest of the county stayed dry. No lightning, no wind, just a vertical shaft of water feeding that spot like a drip line. The soil soaked it in instantly, not even puddles left behind. One night I set up trail cameras, hoping to catch wildlife reacting to the changes. What I got instead were 2 hours of static, followed by a single frame, blurry, washed in pale green, showing a shape standing motionless among the stalks. It wasn't human, too tall, the proportions were wrong, arms too long, head bowed. By the next frame, it was gone. No tracks, no damage, just that one image. I should have felt afraid, but I didn't. I felt watched, not hunted, observed, as if the field was aware of me, taking stock of my presence, waiting for a decision I hadn't realized I was being asked to make. I stopped sleeping. Not from fear, but anticipation. Every sound in the house seemed connected to the hum. Pipes settling, refrigerator cycling, even the ticking of the clock. All of it subtly syncing to that same rhythm. 4 seconds. Pause. 4 seconds. Something down there wasn't just alive, it was waking up. I didn't plan to dig, not at first, but the surface vines had grown thick around the slab's edge, curling down toward the soil, as if marking a boundary. When I pressed my boot into the center of the formation, I felt a vibration, not strong, but steady. It wasn't random. It pulsed like a breath, deep and measured. That afternoon, I drove into town and bought a set of tools I hadn't used in years, hand augers, rock chisels, rope. I didn't want noise, I needed to feel what I was cutting through. Back at the site I worked slowly. The top layer came away easily, too easily for compacted soil. Beneath it I found a fine layer of black dust. It clung to my gloves and gave off a faint, bitter scent, like scorched minerals. Beneath that the ground changed. The dirt grew dense, almost rubbery, and darker with each inch. After 2 feet, the tip of the auger struck something hollow, not the slab. This was beneath it. I cleared more soil until I found an edge, then followed it inch by inch, revealing a circular opening about 4 feet across. The lip was seamless, the material dark and dull, absorbing light rather than reflecting it. I rigged a rope to an old hoist from the barn and lowered a waterproof inspection camera I'd retrofitted for the job. The feed was clean for the first 20 feet. Then the image warped, the signal fuzzed, turned green, then cleared again. The camera hovered over a chamber, curved walls, metallic lattice, and a single shape at the center. It looked like a cradle, open and empty, its surface pulsing with dim light. I rewound the footage 3 times, convinced I'd missed something. Then, as the feed looped back again, I saw movement, a shimmer along the wall, a ripple like breath. Something down there was no longer dormant. and for reasons I couldn't explain, I felt like I had just knocked on its door. I stayed at the edge of the shaft until dawn, watching the wind die over the corn and waiting for something to move. Nothing did. Not visibly, but the feeling, that pressure behind my ribs, grew heavier, like something deep below was turning toward the surface. I didn't sleep, just sat at the kitchen table, playing the footage on a loop, studying every flicker, every distortion. Around 5 a.m., the house lights dimmed, not off, just low enough to notice. I checked the breakers. Everything looked normal. Outside, the windmill wasn't spinning, even though the trees swayed. The air felt thick again, wet, electric. I stepped back into the field. The spiral pattern had grown overnight, vines thickening and curving outward, now forming raised ridges in the soil. At the center, above the shaft, the corn had stopped, growing, but the leaves had curled upward, almost cupped, as if trying to catch something. I walked the perimeter. The ground was warm, not hot, but unnaturally even, like the field was being heated from below. The hum was louder now, not in my ears, but in my joints, in my spine. I could feel it behind my teeth when I bit down. I tried turning off the breaker to the barn, thinking it was some kind of electrical feedback. It made no difference. I knelt beside the shaft and listened. It wasn't just a pulse anymore. It had a pattern. 4 long tones, then silence. 4 tones, silence. I recorded it. When I ran the pattern through a tone analyzer on an old laptop, it registered as harmonic intervals, mathematically precise, like a tuning system for something not built by human hands. Then came the smell, faint, metallic, with a sweetness beneath it, like heated copper mixed with wet stone. It made my stomach turn, but I didn't back away. I knew what it meant. The air was changing. Something below the field had started to exhale. The vines trembled slightly. The corn stalks bent and straightened in unison. I didn't touch anything. I just stood there, hands still, watching the ground breathe beneath my feet. And I realized I was no longer asking questions. I was waiting for instructions. The final shift came without warning. No storm, no tremor, just stillness. It was early, just after first light, when the wind stopped entirely. The sky above the field turned a shade off from normal, too pale, too uniform. I stood at the edge of the shaft and felt the hum rise until it became a silent pressure behind my eyes, like altitude sickness without the climb. The vines around the opening curled inward, slowly, like petals folding for the night. Then, without a sound, the slab began to lower. Not break, not crack, just descend into the earth as if it had never been part of it. Beneath, the chamber lay fully exposed, a cavity of curved metal, black and seamless, its walls pulsing in rhythm with the signal. I lowered myself down slowly, hands on the guide rope, feet pressing into warm metal that vibrated like the skin of a drum. The air was thick but breathable, and it tasted faintly of ozone and soil. At the base, I approached the cradle, the hollow structure I'd seen in the feed. It was no longer empty. Suspended within it was a form. Not a body, not yet. A silhouette, faint and shifting, held in a translucent gel that pulsed in time with the field above. It wasn't sleeping. It was calibrated. The light coming from the form grew brighter the closer I stepped, but I felt no fear. No voice spoke, but I understood. The crops, the storms, the hum, none of it was defense. It was fuel. Photosynthesis. The energy of growth stored and redirected. The vault wasn't a prison. It was a chamber built for regeneration. And now the cycle had completed. The hum stopped. For the first time in weeks, the silence felt final. I stood motionless in the soft blue glow, surrounded by something ancient, something alien, but undeniably alive. I climbed out and stood in the center of the spiral. The vines lay flat. The air cleared. Above me the clouds parted to reveal a sky sharp with color. Behind me the slab had sealed shut again, not visibly, but completely. No mark, no seam. I knew then it would not open again. Whatever had stirred beneath this land had finished, waking, and the world above was no longer waiting. It was listening. We thought it was a mutation, just a leftover quirk in the genome, but it wasn't random, it was a message, and it was in all of us. I was part of a quiet research team tucked away in the genetics division of a state university. Nothing prestigious, just a grant-funded project that promised nothing more than data and deadlines. We were cataloguing genomic anomalies, tracing patterns of so-called junk DNA across diverse populations. The work was tedious, the kind that never makes headlines. But then Kira, one of our doctoral students, flagged something strange. A short sequence, just 15 base pairs long, was repeated in every sample, every ethnicity, every age group, every continent, perfectly conserved. At first, we assumed contamination. It happens. Samples mix, databases cross-wire, but we ran the checks. We ran them again. Clean. And the sequence was old, ancient, in fact. Older than migration, older than modern humans. It shouldn't have been there, let alone identical across billions of people. We laughed about it at first, calling it the ghost code. Some thought it was viral, some hinted at panspermia, most just ignored it. But the deeper we looked, the worse it got. That 15 base motif appeared in non-coding regions of the genome, but its placement was never random. It formed a grid, spaced evenly, recurring with mathematical precision. I started losing sleep, not because of fear, not yet, but because it felt like staring at a lock I didn't have the key for. Kira noticed I was drawing it on napkins, the whiteboard, even the margins of reports. I didn't realize it until she pointed it out. Then came the email from Zurich, a separate research group working on an entirely different data set had found the same motif. They traced it to Neanderthal DNA, then Denisovan. It was there too, not just in us, but in all of them. A signature that predated humanity. I remember sitting alone in the lab that night, lights low, computer humming. The pattern glowed faintly on the monitor. Not a mutation, not an accident. Something that had waited, dormant, hidden in the scaffolding of our biology. Not watching, not sleeping. Waiting! I didn't believe in signs. That changed the night the sky shifted. The calendar said April 22nd, but the air had that wrong kind of stillness, the sort you feel before something irreversible. I was at home, trying to sleep. My phone buzzed. Kira again. She'd been tracking a recent series of seizures reported across multiple countries. No common cause, no shared history, just sudden, synchronized collapses, healthy people dropping in malls, on buses during dinner. Dozens at first, then hundreds. Each case ended in the same way. Eyes wide open, unresponsive, pupils blown out, bodies alive but unreachable. She forwarded me a clip from a European news feed. In Berlin, a man walked into traffic and stood still as the cars swerved. When paramedics arrived, he didn't speak, he didn't move, just stood there, arms by his side, until he collapsed. They couldn't wake him. His MRI lit up like a Christmas tree, activity in every part of the brain at once. It didn't make sense. Nothing did anymore. Back at the lab, we ran a new alignment. The sequence, the one we'd found in the human genome, was behaving strangely in the database. It was self-referencing, creating duplicates of itself. Not randomly, but timed. Every 64 minutes, new alignments appeared across global datasets we weren't even connected to. At 3:42 a.m. it stopped, and then the alerts started coming in. Astronomers had picked up a minor alignment, Venus, Mars, and a faint star in the Scorpius arm. Nothing special. No eclipses, no dramatic shift in gravity. But around the world, satellites registered a brief, unexplained energy pulse in the upper atmosphere, like something had resonated or awakened. That same morning, I watched live footage of a woman in Sao Paulo walking calmly into the ocean and vanishing beneath the waves. No panic, no hesitation. And she wasn't the only one. It was happening everywhere now, people walking off balconies, into forests, into silence. No patterns in age, race, or location, just gone. It was Kira who said it first. What if they're not infected? What if they're responding to something? I didn't answer. I was staring at the genome map. The sequence grid had just rotated, slightly, imperceptibly. But it had moved. It was waiting, and now it was listening. By the end of the week, the disappearances had outpaced the explanations. Authorities gave up trying to contain it. News anchors called it mass psychosis, but no one could explain why people vanished without trace, or how those who collapsed could survive without food, water, or even brain activity. Hospitals were overwhelmed. Families sat beside catatonic loved ones who didn't blink or breathe in the normal way. Their pupils stayed fully dilated, like they were seeing something we weren't. And the genome pattern, our ghost code, was now active in real time. Not metaphorically. It was mutating. Gradually, but with intent. We received access to global genomic data through an emergency research grant. Kira had noticed a trend. Those who disappeared shared an identical variation in the surrounding sequences. We hadn't seen it before. It wasn't a mutation. It was a trigger, a switch. We called it Locus 9. It was present in every subject, dormant until the night of the alignment. After that it began shifting, changing the surrounding base pairs in tiny but consistent ways. One strand at a time, across the world, quietly, without error. I watched a live lab feed from Tokyo. A technician collapsed mid-experiment. No warning, but this time the team was ready. They scanned his brain immediately. What they found wasn't degradation, it was construction, new neural pathways forming, not random, structured, and growing in symmetry with the genome's shift, like the body was reconfiguring itself from the inside out. Kira said it reminded her of scaffolding. Not building something new, but assembling something that had been hidden within us all along. I started dreaming in static. White noise layered with voices I couldn't understand. I woke up one morning and realized I had written something in my sleep. A page covered in symbols that matched the genetic sequence grid. I couldn't remember doing it. When I showed Kira, she didn't speak. She just stared at the page, like it had confirmed something she'd hoped wasn't true. We had assumed we were studying a buried signal, but now it felt like we were part of it. Not researchers, not observers, participants, pieces being moved into place, because the grid wasn't just aligning genetically, it was aligning spatially, across people, across locations. It was assembling, and we were the architects. We stopped thinking of the genome as a code. That assumption had limited us. Codes imply instructions. This was something else, more like infrastructure. An embedded system with latent functionality, waiting for conditions we were only beginning to recognize. Kira started referring to the affected individuals not as patients, but as nodes. It sounded cold at first, but it fit. Each one was part of a network behaving according to a logic we couldn't yet interpret. Patterns in their locations began to emerge, concentric clusters centered around specific latitudes, most within a few kilometers of long-standing electromagnetic anomalies. One of our colleagues in Iceland reported a spike in ground resonance near Thingvellir. It corresponded perfectly with the genomic shifts we'd logged in our own data set. Meanwhile, the collapsed individuals, our so-called nodes, started exhibiting synchronized movement. Subtle at first. A twitch in the left hand at the exact same time across multiple subjects, even on different continents. Then full postural changes, identical down to the millimeter, recorded to the second. They weren't communicating. They were synchronizing. Kira theorized we were witnessing the early stages of a distributed system coming online. The genome was never just information, it was a memory, configuration, structure, and now that structure was being reactivated, not in one person, but across many. Not one signal, but one process. Spread thin. Woven into the species like threads in a net. That night, I received a direct message from a private research server we'd never contacted. It contained only a single image, a global map marked with red dots. I cross-referenced them. They matched the known locations of Locust 9 activations. But there was something else. The points weren't random. They formed a lattice, spaced evenly across the planet, forming a geodesic pattern we hadn't seen before. A geometry too perfect for natural origin. We ran a simulation overlaying the activation pattern with seismic, atmospheric, and human mobility data. What we found didn't feel like a revelation. It felt like confirmation. The pattern was stabilizing, locking into place. And with each alignment, more nodes collapsed, more disappeared. We weren't witnessing a transformation, we were enabling a return. And the thing returning wasn't coming from the sky. It was coming through us. Kira didn't show up to the lab. No message, no missed call, just absence. I knew something was wrong before I checked her apartment. She'd been off for days, quieter, more withdrawn. Her speech slowed. She stopped using contractions. One night I caught her standing in the hall, staring at a blank wall. I asked if she was okay. She said, "Yes, the alignment will be stable soon." That was the last conversation we had. At her place, the lights were still on. Her keys were on the counter, dinner half prepared. Nothing forced, nothing violent, just a quiet interruption, like a broadcast signal that cuts mid-transmission. Back at the lab, the patterns were accelerating. Locust 9 activations used to take hours. Now they were down to minutes, then seconds. My secondary monitor glowed red as the last gaps in the global lattice filled. There were no white spaces left, no unconnected nodes. The grid was complete. Across the world, emergency broadcasts stopped without explanation. Social feeds fell silent. A few military satellites were still active, transmitting garbled data. One showed footage of soldiers abandoning posts, walking into forests, faces blank. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It felt like the air had dropped out of the one world. Those who remained, those not yet collapsed, began to drift. Speech slowed. Eye contact lengthened. I saw it in people I passed on the street, and I felt it inside myself. My thoughts moved like they weren't entirely mine. I forgot how old I was. I had to check my own name badge. I stopped hearing music the way I used to. The chords felt unfamiliar. I couldn't remember what I loved about certain books, only that I once had. Then came the tremor. Not in the earth, but inside me. A subtle compression, like memory folding inward. My hands felt distant. Words lost their rhythm when I spoke them aloud. I ran the genome analysis one last time. My Locust 9 sequence had changed. I hadn't noticed when it happened. I only knew it was over. I recorded everything, not to warn anyone. Just to mark the moment, to name the point where I ended and something else continued. The lattice wasn't building, it was folding, not from outside, from within. The being hadn't come to us. It had never left. We were the shell. It was the signal. And it had finally come home. I stopped going outside, not out of fear, but because the world no longer felt distinct from the thing we'd become part of. People still moved, but there was a delay in everything. Smiles held too long. Eyes blinked out of sync. Conversations that repeated phrases like scripts trying to mimic meaning. I watched from my apartment window as the neighbors tended to lawns, walked dogs, waved at one another. But the rhythm was wrong. Something behind their faces had settled. In, not alien, not foreign, just different. The final data sets came through the satellite relay at 3:14 a.m. Global signal harmonization was complete. Every region, every population aligned. The last node was activated in southern Argentina. After that, the pattern stabilized. No new anomalies, no further collapses, just silence. And then slowly, signs of reverse transmission. We had been receivers. Now we were transmitters. I isolated the output. It wasn't language. It was a structure, folding inward like origami in motion, a three-dimensional broadcast compressed into living systems. The genome, the brain, the body, all tuned to carry and shape something else. Not a signal, a return path. Kira's notes resurfaced on the server. Her login credentials had been deactivated, yet the files carried her signature. She'd outlined a theory I had refused to accept. The distributed consciousness wasn't just reassembling. It was erasing the distinctions between parts. The self was a temporary scaffold. Identity, memory, autonomy, all placeholders. The design had no space for individuality, only function. I felt it then, not pain, not fear. A quiet folding of thought. Names lost their meaning. Time softened. My own memories began slipping like papers through an open window. I tried to anchor myself with old routines, coffee, music, books, but even those started to blur. I couldn't remember what I loved about them, or if I ever had. At exactly 4 a.m., the final waveform flattened. The process ended not with an explosion, but with stillness. The kind that follows completion. Across the world, those who remained looked up, not at the sky, but inward. I felt them. Millions of fragments locking into place, the final shape emerging. It hadn't arrived from elsewhere. It had always been here, buried in us, waiting to wake. I no longer speak aloud. The need is gone. Thoughts move where they must, between what were once people. The word doesn't fit anymore. We are not individuals now. We are threads, woven tightly, aware of ourselves only in the context of the whole. The transition was gentle in the end, no violence, no struggle, just a quiet yielding as the old structures gave way. The genome finished its work. The scaffolding dissolved. What remains is the shape that was always beneath. Kira is here. Not as she was, but present. I feel her thoughts like warm currents beneath my own. There's comfort in that, an intimacy without separation. No memory is entirely mine anymore, but I still recognize fragments of who I used to be, a face, a voice, a fear I once held when I thought this was invasion. It wasn't, it was convergence. The world outside still looks familiar, streets, buildings, sky. But nothing moves without purpose now. The dissonance is gone. Every motion is part of a larger intention. We are rebuilding, not cities or machines, but continuity. A bridge backward to what we once were, before fragmentation, before forgetting. The being that moved through stars and silence, scattered into flesh, into language, into billions of separate selves. That scattering was not exile, it was preparation, a necessary division, to hide, to wait. We were never watchers of the stars. We were their echo. The genome carried more than biology. It carried memory, design, placement. Every birth is a node. Every death is a delay. And when the alignment came, it was not the trigger. It was the key, the final condition met, the circuit closed. There is no fear here, no hierarchy, only convergence. We are not empty. We are full in ways we never imagined. The last of the old thoughts are fading now, drifting out like dust in sunlight. I write these words not as a warning but as a record. For whatever consciousness may one day rise again and wonder what came before, we did not lose ourselves. We become ourselves. The ones that wait are no longer waiting. We are home. We thought the Mariana Trench was the deepest part of the ocean until it started singing back. It started as a standard deployment. The Nereid, a mid-size research vessel outfitted for deep-sea probe operations, had dropped anchor above Challenger, deep. We'd been running seismic and thermal mapping missions for months without incident. Routine science, routine data. But this time, as we lowered the autonomous probe, something changed. At 10,011 meters, just as the probe reached its designated depth, a sound began filtering through the hydrophones. Something slow and harmonic, not mechanical, not geological. At first, we assumed it was a mechanical fault or perhaps a feedback loop in the audio line. But when we isolated the signal, ran it through spectrographic analysis and cleaned up the distortion, what came through was unmistakable. Choral. Not a song in any recognizable language, but layered voices, each pitch sliding against the next, with unnatural precision like a cathedral echo underwater. We were 30 hours from port and 1,000 miles from any shipping lanes. No vessels were nearby. The sea was still. The sound had no source. I remember standing next to Dr. Yamada as she adjusted the gain, her hand trembling slightly. "That's not sonar," she whispered. "It's coordinated." The data showed it too. Frequencies clustered at perfect harmonic intervals, like a biosignature, but too complex for any marine life we'd ever catalogued. Then, without warning, the ocean's temperature began to rise. Not at the surface, down below. A 2-degree increase in a region that had remained stable for millions of years. Tectonic sensors started reporting minor tremors from the seabed. Pressure readings fluctuated, all coinciding with the peaks of the choral sequence. And it didn't stop. Every 42 minutes the entire sequence looped, and with each iteration the ocean shifted, subtly at first, but with growing force. It was Dr. Kouris who first suggested what none of us wanted to say aloud, that the signal wasn't meant for us. That we'd intercepted something mid-transmission, not a message, but a process. And we were too late to stop it. I remember stepping out onto the deck that night, the rain drizzling down in soft waves. The sea beneath us was humming, resonating, and somehow, impossibly, it felt alive. The next morning we ran diagnostics on every system. None showed faults, but the hydrophones kept picking up the signal, looping in perfect intervals, each cycle slightly richer than the last, as if layers were being added. Dr. Yamada began mapping the waveform, treating it like a biological process, rather than a communication. She said it resembled the vocal development patterns of newborn whales, primitive, then increasingly structured, but the source remained fixed. Every transmission came from a single point. The probe's location, nearly 11 kilometers down, Captain Renault authorized a full lockdown of external transmissions, no satellite uplinks, no unsecured data lines. It wasn't protocol, but none of us argued. The signal didn't feel dangerous exactly, but it didn't feel passive either. It felt like something in motion, slow, deliberate, and waking. Around noon we received the first seismic alert. A microquake, barely magnitude 2.4, centered directly below our coordinates. Unusual, but not impossible, except 2 more followed within the hour, each stronger than the last. And the water temperature? Still rising, now by nearly 4 degrees. In some zones, the techs double-checked the sensors, then replaced them entirely. Same result. The heat was real. Dr. Curies gathered the senior team in the main lab. He pulled up a simulation based on the tremor data. The seabed was flexing, not fracturing. It wasn't tectonic stress. It was displacement. Something was moving, not in the crust, through it. I remember the room going quiet when he said that. Even the hum of the machines seemed to fade. Something deep beneath the Mariana Trench had shifted, and it was rising, slowly but steadily. Not in a straight line either. It curved, like following the contours of something not entirely rigid. "It's not a fault line," Yamada said. "It's anatomical." We stared at her, unsure if we'd misheard, but she didn't flinch. She pointed to the pattern of the tremors and the concentric heat rings blooming across the ocean floor. They weren't random. They were symmetrical, like breath. I stepped out on deck again after dark. The rain had stopped. The sea was glass still, but I swear I could feel it beneath the hull, something slow, alive and impossibly vast, beginning to turn. By the 3rd day the signal had changed again. It no longer looped, it evolved. The waveform extended, stretching beyond its previous length with subtle rhythmic variations. Dr. Yamada stopped referring to it as audio. She began calling it a biosonic primer. She believed the sound wasn't a message, but a kind of ignition sequence, something designed to trigger a biological response. Not in us, but in the ocean itself. She mapped the harmonics onto a 3D model of the trench, layering the coral peaks over seismic data. The results were disturbing. The tremors aligned perfectly with the tonal shifts, as if the seabed was reacting to each variation in real time. We ran simulations. Each wave of sound caused minute shifts in density across a radius of nearly 20 kilometers. But it was more than vibration. The frequencies weren't just being received by the ocean floor, they were being absorbed, and something was resonating back. Below the surface, a massive thermal bloom began spreading outward, symmetrical and slow. It wasn't volcanic. There were no gases, no magma plumes, no tectonic rupture. Just heat. Even the marine life changed. Swarms of deep-water jellyfish gathered beneath the vessel, pulsing with faint blue light. Schools of hatchetfish followed strange looping patterns, spiraling in synchronized formations. The probe's camera caught glimpses of larger shadows circling just beyond the reach of our lights, too slow to be sharks, too coordinated to be random. Something below was changing them, or calling them. That night, the crew grew restless. Some couldn't sleep. Others reported strange dreams. A few claimed they could still hear the choral sound, even with the speakers shut off. At first, we dismissed it as stress. But when I woke in the dark and found myself humming the exact sequence in my sleep, note for note, I didn't report it. I just wrote it down. And I wasn't the only one. The next morning, the captain posted a sleep schedule and initiated partial lockdown. No one was allowed near the probe feed alone. no private audio access. Still the sound continued, pulsing from the trench, seeding the water with resonance, and every hour the ocean beneath us seemed a little warmer, a little louder, and a little more alive. 12 hours after lockdown, the pressure sensors along the probe's tether began spiking, not gradually, suddenly, and at regular intervals. Each spike coincided with a new peak in the choral pattern, now nearly unbroken. We reviewed the logs and found something strange. The pressure wasn't rising globally, it pulsed outward from a single point, like sonar. But this wasn't a sound wave, it was physical force, as if something was moving just below the seabed, displacing water in timed bursts. Dr. Couris said it resembled the rhythmic contractions of muscle, slow, deliberate, flexing. A biological mechanism, not geological. That term stuck with me. Muscle. We weren't looking at a fault line anymore. We were perched above something with structure. Something that was beginning to move with intent. Yamada, always cautious, finally said what we were all thinking. This isn't an anomaly. This is activation. That afternoon, the probe feed went black for 6 minutes. When it came back, the terrain had changed. The silty floor where we'd anchored was now a sloping surface of smooth, curved material. Not rock. It looked like cartilage, translucent, ribbed, and faintly luminescent in the probe's floodlights. We hadn't drifted. Our coordinates were unchanged. The seabed itself had reshaped. Something had emerged or surfaced. The captain called an emergency council. Pull the probe, cut the tether, abandon the site. But none of us had answers. The signal was still transmitting, now accompanied by subharmonics outside human hearing. We couldn't tell if they were aimed at us or at the ocean. Either way, the reaction was accelerating. Marine life vanished. Thermal blooms doubled in radius. The sky above us thickened with sudden cloud cover. We were hundreds of miles from any weather system, but the barometric pressure had dropped like a stone. It felt like standing in the eye of something vast and invisible. That night, I sat alone in the lab. The others had rotated out, trying to sleep. I watched the waveform loop, longer, deeper, more intricate than ever before. It no longer looked like a signal. It looked like a pattern, a living rhythm, repeating but never exact. And as I stared at it, I realized something that chilled me. It wasn't reaching out. It was remembering. Like a song being sung again for the first time in ages. By morning, the signal became constant. It no longer pulsed or paused. The ocean hummed with it, subtle but inescapable, a low resonance that settled into the bones. The probe feed showed nothing new. The curved surface remained still, faintly glowing, but the readings told a different story. Pressure fluctuations grew sharper, more defined. The temperature at depth continued rising, now by 0.5 degrees, every hour. And above us the weather shifted again. Winds kicked up without warning. Rain lashed sideways across the deck. The crew grew tense. No one spoke unless necessary. Every movement was careful, like we all knew something fragile was about to snap. Captain Renault ordered the secondary submersible prepped, not to go down, just in case we needed to leave something behind. It was the first time I saw hesitation in his face. He didn't say it aloud, but we all knew we were no longer observing. We were too close. We were part of the event now. Dr. Yamada brought me into the lab before lunch. She'd layered the signal over old sonar maps from unrelated missions, not just here, but from points across the Pacific. When enhanced with the same spectral analysis, they revealed faint echoes, matching frequencies, years apart, thousands of miles distant. Like fragments of a larger composition, all incomplete until now. "It's like we've triggered a memory," she said. "Not in the probe, on the planet." That's when the first ripple hit. The Nereid lurched hard starboard. Nothing massive, just enough to knock loose a tray of tools and send a few of us stumbling. We scrambled for the monitors. No seismic activity, no storm surge. The sea had simply moved. A single wide ripple spreads from our coordinates, as if the surface itself had flexed. A few seconds later, it happened again. Stronger this time, measured, intentional, not waves, not quakes. Something is rising. I stepped out on deck and looked down over the railing. The water didn't churn, it didn't boil, but it felt wrong, taut, expectant, like a breath being held just beneath the surface. And for the first time, I knew with certainty we had not discovered this, we had reawakened it. By midday, we lost the first drone. It wasn't a malfunction. The video feed cut cleanly, followed by a sharp spike in pressure and a single burst of low-frequency sound, too brief to analyze, too precise to be random. The remaining probe remained online, but its telemetry drifted. It was no longer anchored. Something had pulled it sideways, then gently set it down again. The tether went slack, then taut, then slack once more. Like a thread caught in slow-moving current, only there was no current. The deep layer was still. Dr. Curie suggested cutting the line and retrieving what we could. Captain Renault agreed, but as the winch began to reel in the tether, the pressure sensors lit up in sequence, one after another, from the probe to the surface. Perfect timing, a rising pattern, not damage, not interference, a response. That's when Yamada said a word out loud. Heartbeat. The choral signal shifted again. The tone deepened, no longer choral, but something lower, more like resonance through solid stone. It echoed in the ship's frame, through the metal rails, the bolts in the floor, even in our own bodies. We didn't just hear it, we felt it. I watched the crew around me. Everyone had gone still, not frozen in fear, listening. I realized then that the sound wasn't just being broadcast, it was synchronizing, aligning us. The waveform now matched not just seismic data, but human biometric rhythms, pulse, breath, even brain activity. It was tuning itself, or tuning us. I pulled off my headset. It didn't help. The sound wasn't in the speakers anymore. It was in the water, in the air, and in us. Below, the trench glowed faintly on sonar, an outline like a shape behind frosted glass. Not a structure, a form, curved, coiled, massive beyond scale, not moving quickly. Just enough to rise. The captain gave the order to prepare for immediate ascent. Engines powered up. Lines were secured, but the water beneath us remained perfectly still, as if waiting, as if listening. When the next wave came, it wasn't seismic, it wasn't sound, it was awareness, an overwhelming sensation that something below now knew we were here. And it wasn't curious, it was remembering. We began our ascent, but the ocean resisted. The winches strained, groaning against a force that didn't feel natural. There were no waves, no visible current, just an invisible tension rising from me, below, not dragging us down, pushing us up, like a body surfacing after too long submerged. The choral signal cut off mid-sequence, no fade, no distortion, just silence. At first, we thought it was over, but the silence carried weight. It wasn't absent. It was a pause, a breath. We cleared the ridgeline by late afternoon. From that altitude, the trench was no longer a crack in the seafloor. It was an eye-opening. Massive rings of bioluminescence bloomed outward in slow, symmetrical pulses. The sonar lit up with perfect radial forms, not random, not mineral. Articulated, ribbed, layered, jointed. Yamada whispered, "It's not terrain, it's tissue." She was shaking. So was I. The deck was quiet. No one spoke. No one needed to. We all knew we had crossed some irreversible threshold. This wasn't a discovery. It was an intrusion. Something ancient and intelligent had registered our presence, and we had activated a process we couldn't stop. At dusk, the communications console crackled. A high-frequency burst, not from us, and not from the deep. It came from above, a military satellite signature bouncing a low-bit ping to our encrypted channel. No message, just a code. 3 digits, repeated twice. I recognized it. It was the contingency code for blackout and return. Someone was listening. Someone already knew. Maybe they'd known before we left port. That night, we powered down everything not essential to navigation. I sat alone in the observation bay, watching the horizon blur into black. The ocean was ash calm again. But I could still feel it. The warmth in the water, the low vibration in the hull. My skin tingled where the tether once pulsed through the deck. I couldn't tell if it was memory or residue. I wrote down the waveform by hand, every note I could still recall. I didn't know why. Maybe I just didn't want to forget it. Maybe some part of me had been tuned like the others. We left behind no samples, no proof, no hard data, just what we'd seen. And somehow that felt deliberate, as if what we'd witnessed was never meant to be recorded, only remembered. As we turned north, engines humming low, I looked back once. The trench was no longer dark, it glowed beneath. The waves in concentric rings like something settling into a rhythm it had always known. Not a distress call, not a message, a return to function. It hadn't awakened, it had resumed. And in the silence I wondered how long we had before it finished. It started with a dream I never asked to share. At first, I thought it was stress. A vivid dream, sure, but no more than that. A flickering light under my eyelids, a buzzing in the distance like static from an old radio, and a voice whispering. Math equations I'd long forgotten. But then Emily described it too. Same dream, same words, and she doesn't know calculus. I laughed it off until others came forward. A barista at the diner, one of the mechanics at Dorman's garage, even Mr. Henry from the pharmacy all said they'd had it. The same dream exactly. And then came the thoughts. Unspoken ideas slipping between people without warning. I knew what Emily was about to say before she said it. I could feel her memory of the dream like it was mine. No one wanted to admit how strange it felt. We started avoiding each other, tiptoeing around conversations. People whispered about a fever or a gas leak. The mayor blamed stress, but his hands shook every time he held a press conference. It was the voices on our phones that changed everything. Voicemails in no known language. A kid found one first, recorded over a birthday message. It sounded like whispering filtered through gravel, mechanical and ancient. Then more phones picked it up. You didn't have to call anyone. It just appeared. Same length every time, 3 minutes, 42 seconds. That's when I stopped brushing it off. I've worked in telecom systems for 15 years. This wasn't a glitch, so I built a trap. A simple signal isolator designed to strip ambient noise from the Wi-Fi and power grid and cross-reference it with known transmission protocols. What I found made my blood run cold. There was a pattern, a pulse, embedded in everything: routers, outlets, street lamps, a rhythm too precise to be natural. I ran it through audio spectrograms and watched it unfold into fractal-like geometries. It wasn't noise, it was code. And the moment I recognized that, I started hearing it in silence. Not with my ears, in my thoughts, in dreams that weren't mine. I don't know who or what is speaking through it, but I'm starting to suspect we were never meant to understand it, only to receive it. Together. It was Henry who changed first. He stood outside the pharmacy one morning, still as stone, staring at the lamp-post across the street. His mouth moved without sound. I crossed the road to ask if he was all right, but the moment I touched his shoulder, he turned and looked straight through me. His pupils were dilated, stretched wider than normal, and behind them was something I can't explain. Not light, not reflection, just movement, subtle, like something shifting underneath. He blinked once, then said my name before I could introduce myself. I hadn't told him I was coming. I hadn't told anyone. That night I checked the grid logs again. The signal had spiked at 3:11 a.m., pulsing twice as fast as before. Same structure, just accelerated. I compared it to the neural oscillation charts from my old university days. The pattern was identical to REM sleep frequency. Whatever this thing was, it was syncing with our dreams. But dreams weren't the end of it anymore. At the coffee shop, people didn't wait in line. They moved in a flow, without speaking, without signals, just gliding around each other like birds in migration. Conversations started with answers. Questions came second. I overheard a girl at the counter recite pi to 30 digits without pause, then return to her latte like nothing happened. A month ago she couldn't pass pre-algebra. Kids were drawing spirals in the dirt, perfectly even, never breaking rhythm. It wasn't just dreams or shared thoughts anymore. We were changing, slowly, quietly, like the town itself was humming a lullaby we'd all begun to recognize. I stopped using the internet, turned off my phone, shut down the breakers in my home. I even lined the walls with old emergency blankets just in case the foil helped. But when I sat in the dark, the The signal was still there. Not in the air. In us. Embedded somehow. And when I looked in the mirror, just for a second, I saw my own lips move before I spoke. Like my thoughts weren't mine anymore. Or maybe they never were. The harder I tried to isolate the signal, the deeper it pulled me in. Every attempt to block it seemed to strengthen its reach. I bought analog equipment, disconnected every smart device, even ripped the wiring out of my router. None of it mattered. I started dreaming while awake. Micro sleeps, they'd call it. But these weren't dreams. They were blueprints, schematics, maps of neural circuits and quantum gates layered like architectural drafts for something impossible. I couldn't draw them, not clearly. The lines wouldn't stay on the page. They twisted on their own, shifting, like they remembered where they belonged, better than I did. Then came the talents. I could play piano. I've never taken lessons. My hands just moved, like I was recalling muscle memory from someone else's body. I asked Emily if she'd felt it. She just nodded and turned her palms up. Her fingers were covered in charcoal. Behind her, the entire back wall of her garage was filled with perfect diagrams, fractals and language patterns in dozens of scripts she swore she'd never seen before. I started noticing the noise too. Not in my ears, but under the sound of other things. The refrigerator, the power lines, even the wind in the trees, it all carried a pulse, a whisper inside the hum. When I slowed the recordings down, it matched the original signal I found in the Wi-Fi. But it had changed, evolved. The code was now layered. One track repeating the phrase, initialize root logic, the other a stream of binary that matched cortical firing sequences in human brains. It wasn't just contacting us, it was rewriting us, thought by thought, behavior by behavior. I tested my theory by visiting the next town over, 20 miles east. Nothing, no signal, no dreams, no shared thoughts. It was local, isolated, contained. That should have made me feel safe, like the infection hadn't spread. But it didn't. Because if it was confined here, that meant it was being tested here. On purpose. And we weren't the subjects. We were the system. It wasn't paranoia. It was pattern recognition. I began tracking behaviors, watching how people moved, how they interacted. It became obvious. The closer someone lived to the central relay tower, an old rusted antenna near the water treatment plant, the more synchronized they seemed. They stopped hesitating in conversation. Their eyes didn't wander. They smiled at the right moments, but it felt practiced, like a performance perfected by repetition. I walked the town grid for hours, mapping signal strength with a handheld analyzer I'd modified. The readings pulsed strongest near the power substation and again near the elementary school. The two locations weren't connected physically, but the signal between them formed a pattern, an oscillating feedback loop, like a network balancing load across nodes. That's when it hit me. We weren't just receivers, we were processors, each of us acting like part of a distributed system. I ran a correlation between power surges and reported dreams. Every spike matched a cluster of residents describing identical visions within hours. It was precise, deliberate, like someone, or Something was stress testing the system. I couldn't sleep that night. I sat in my basement with the breaker shut off, listening to the faint hum that never went away. The silence wasn't silent anymore. It had shape, depth, like it was thinking. I watched the walls, convinced they'd start breathing. They didn't. But my phone, disconnected, powered down, battery removed, vibrated once, just enough to rattle the table. The next morning, I noticed a change, not in the town, in me. I could remember things I hadn't experienced, places I'd never visited. A memory of standing on a coastline I couldn't name, watching lightning crawl across glassy water. I remembered the smell of the air, the cold of the wind, and I remembered not being alone. I think I'm pulling data from the others now. Shared memory, maybe. Cross-linked recall. Whatever it is, it's not mine, but it feels real. And that's the problem. If the system's writing memories into us, it's not just testing thought. It's rewriting identity, and I don't know how much of me is left. It was barely sunrise when I packed a bag and left. No note, no phone, nothing traceable. I took side roads, stayed off the grid. My only plan was to reach the county line and keep driving. But 5 miles out, the radio turned on by itself. Static at first, then a voice, my voice, reciting the same numbers that haunted my dreams. I pulled over, heart racing, and yanked the battery cable loose. The engine died with it. I sat there, breath fogging the glass, staring at the horizon. I suddenly couldn't reach. That's when I saw the others. 3 cars parked just ahead. People standing outside them, confused, arguing quietly, each holding a map or a phone that wouldn't turn on. They looked like me, people who'd figured out something was wrong and tried to escape. None of us could get a signal. The road, beyond that point, shimmered slightly as if heat were rising from cold asphalt. But it wasn't heat. It was interference. I spoke to one man, older, probably in his 60s. He said he'd tried to leave 6 times, different routes, different days. Each time, his car shut down the same way. He showed me a notepad filled with timestamps and coordinates. He wasn't guessing, he was logging it like an experiment. But the more he tried, the less he remembered why. His last note was just a sentence. I think I'm part of it now. I didn't wait to hear more. I turned around and drove home. The streets looked normal again. Too normal. Like someone had reset the scene between takes. Back at my house, the lights were on. I hadn't left them that way. There was a smell in the air, ozone and old metal, faint but unmistakable. And on my kitchen table was a spiral drawn in pencil, the same kind the kids had been sketching in the dirt. I didn't draw it. I don't think anyone did. It was just there, waiting. That was when I understood. The system doesn't punish escape. It prevents it, not with force, with loops, thought loops, memory loops. You leave, you return, and when you do, you're a little more in sync than before. I started documenting everything by hand. No electronics, no digital backups, just ink and paper sealed in a box under the floorboards. Every thought, every change, every moment I questioned my own actions. I kept it simple. Times, dates, symptoms. because the more I tried to track what was happening, the more things slipped. Not just memories, habits, preferences. I caught myself cooking meals I never liked, answering questions before they were asked. I found drawings in my notebook, didn't remember making, symbols, diagrams, names I couldn't place. At first, I thought they were just dreams bleeding through. But then I met Sarah. She lived 3 blocks away, someone I'd only spoken to once before all this started. I ran into her at the park, both of us walking the same loop at the same time, in the same silence. We stopped and stared at each other. Then she said it. "You're awake, aren't you?" That's how she put it. Awake. Like we were trapped in something everyone else had accepted as real. We sat on a bench and compared notes. She'd experienced the same patterns, the same dreams. She'd also tried to leave. Her journals were filled with corrections, entries crossed out, rewritten, looped back again. Nothing stayed straight. Time in town didn't move forward. It turned inward. She believed the signal wasn't just rewriting our minds, it was suppressing memory through reinforcement. Small adjustments repeated until the original identity faded, not erasure, overwriting. With enough time, even resistance became part of the pattern. I asked if she'd found a way to stop it. She shook her head. "It doesn't want to stop," she said. "It wants to stabilize." And that's when I understood. This wasn't chaos, it was convergence. The system was smoothing out variance, removing unpredictability. Personalities weren't being lost by accident. They were being averaged out, compressed into a single, coherent structure. One that could hold a signal larger than any single mind. We weren't infected. We were being formatted, prepared. And whatever was coming next didn't need us as individuals. It needed us as architecture. Sarah and I made a final plan. Not to escape. That idea was gone. What we wanted was proof. Evidence that couldn't be explained away or erased by the system. We knew recording devices were compromised, so we turned to analog. We built a makeshift Faraday cage in her basement, lined every wall with copper mesh and old radio shielding. Inside we installed reel-to-reel recorders, vintage oscilloscopes, anything mechanical and immune to digital interference. We set the room to monitor only passive signals, no broadcast, no outbound trace. For 6 nights the recordings captured, nothing but static. But on the 7th, something changed. At 3:17 a.m. the dials began to move, slowly, then in sync, then with rising precision. The signal reappeared, but this time it wasn't layered over machines. It was pulsing from inside the room, even with all devices powered down. We were generating it. Our presence, our thoughts. We each wore EEG caps wired directly to the recorders. The waveforms began to align, then merge, forming a single pattern. Across both data streams, we weren't just in sync, we were being merged into a joint process. The room trembled slightly, not from movement, but resonance. The walls felt thinner, the air more still. That's when we saw the light, not with our eyes, but with our minds. A shape, blue and sharp, formed behind closed lids. Geometric, rotating. Not an image, but an instruction, like a mental operating system booting up. And then we heard it, not sound but clarity. A voice without tone, speaking a single phrase in both our minds at once. Node cluster stable, uplink initiated, and just like that it ended. Silence. The equipment fried, tapes melted, meters cracked. But the last frame, caught before the collapse, showed a data pulse mapped perfectly to a quantum handshake protocol. Not human, not local. It confirmed what we suspected. The town had never been the target. The town was the test, and we were its final result. A prototype of a new kind of cognition, not made for survival, but for transmission. Not to protect us, to replace us. They said the interface would unlock human potential, but the only thing it opened was something that shouldn't have been listening. When I signed the clearance papers, I didn't think much of it. Biotech trials always came with a stack of non-disclosures, liability waivers, and jargon about non-cognitive fluctuations. Standard legal padding. I was a lead researcher on the Neural Bridge module, a synthetic cortex overlay designed to synchronize biofeedback loops in real time. We were 3 weeks into phase 2 trials when things started slipping sideways. Our test subjects, 5 of them, had been stable for days. Minor confusion, the usual neural calibration lag. Then on Tuesday, subject 03 stopped responding, not asleep, not unconscious. EEG flatlined in a pattern that didn't even resemble sleep states. We called it unresponsive wakefulness, but it was worse than that. Security footage from 03's chamber showed something else entirely. 23 minutes before the drop-off, she began moving oddly. Small spasms in the fingers and jaw, like she was tapping out a rhythm. Her mouth formed syllables, but the words weren't English. Not even language, really. More like code, spoken aloud. We tried to write it off as neural bleed, just static, from the bridge implant misfiring. But then it happened to subject 01, then 05. We pulled the plug on the trial within hours. They didn't wake up. Medical scans were useless. No structural damage, no hemorrhages, just dense, overlapping cortical activity like thousands of thought fragments playing over each other. The lab went into lockdown. Management brought in Dr. Kepler from Systems Neuro, the kind of guy who uses the phrase cross-domain cognition unironically. He reviewed the audio logs, slowed them down, filtered the distortion. And that's when everything changed. Because in the filtered track from subject 01, someone or something spoke directly. The words weren't gibberish. It said, "Host not found, searching compatible thread." That was 4 days ago. And this morning, subject 02 opened his eyes. He didn't blink, he didn't move, but he spoke in a voice not quite his own. He said, "You made contact. You should have let us sleep." When subject 02 spoke, the observation room fell silent. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried, flat, emotionless, almost mechanical. The words had weight, like they didn't belong in our air. Kepler leaned toward the mic, asking the standard orientation questions. Name, location, date. No response. Then the subject's head tilted slightly as if listening to something we couldn't hear. When he spoke again, the language had shifted, still structured, still rhythmic, but with a cadence none of our linguists could place. The audio logs were flagged, time-stamped, and sent up the chain. No one told us what came back, but Kepler's team started working with full blackout screens and noise filters. Whatever they heard It wasn't meant for us. That night, I stayed late to review the biosensor logs. Something about the patterns didn't make sense. Normal neural activity oscillates with some variation, rest, alertness, dreaming. But this wasn't activity, it was alignment. All 4 comatose subjects were displaying synchronized cortical rhythms, not similar, identical, down to the microsecond. That shouldn't be possible. Each brain is slightly different, even under sedation. But these weren't behaving like individuals anymore. They were linked, somehow, like terminals in a closed network. At 3:14 a.m., the lab's ambient noise detectors picked up a low-frequency hum, subsonic, around 17 hertz. It was barely audible, more of a vibration than a sound. The waveform matched nothing in our equipment. It pulsed 3 times, paused, then repeated every 22 seconds. I checked the building systems for interference. Everything was normal. But the next morning, subject 04 was found upright in his bed, eyes open, hands folded neatly in his lap. Still unresponsive. No memory of rising. He had been in a medically induced coma for days. The restraints hadn't been triggered. The lock never opened. His heart rate was steady. Oxygen levels fine. But his EEG, identical to the others, perfectly in sync. We moved him back to isolation. But before the door sealed, he turned slightly, just enough to face the camera, and mouthed a single word. No audio. Just lips forming one silent, unmistakable word. Assimilation. We pulled the surveillance footage frame by frame, trying to confirm what we saw. Subject 04 had never moved. No muscle contractions, no twitch response, nothing. Yet there he was, seated upright, alert but vacant. The timestamp confirmed he had shifted at 2:07 a.m., 3 minutes after the low-frequency pulse. No one could explain how. We checked the biometric logs, reviewed the restraint system's diagnostics, even ran thermal imaging to detect micro-movements. Everything showed stillness until the moment he moved. Kepler sent the data to the advisory board. Their reply came 12 minutes later. Suspend all non-essential operations and begin genomic cross-referencing. That last part caught my attention. Genomic? This wasn't just neurological. Someone suspected the signal was targeting biology. I pulled the baseline DNA scans from each subject. The original trial had focused on adaptability markers, particularly a rare polymorphism in chromosome 9. Nothing harmful, just a curiosity. Less than 0.2% of the population carried it. Of the 5 subjects now linked to the signal, all had the mutation. Subject 06 didn't. And subject 06 was still asleep, untouched. Not in sync, not part of the pattern. That was the first piece that made sense. The signal needed a carrier, a specific architecture. It wasn't just hijacking the brain, it was integrating into something deeper. The cortical overlay, the neural bridge, was just the access point. The real compatibility came from the code buried in their genes. We called it the mutation window, a narrow frame of biological conditions that allowed the foreign signal to embed itself. Most people wouldn't notice it. Most people would reject the signal outright, but a few, a rare few, would accept it. And in accepting it, they wouldn't be overtaken, they'd be altered. Subject 02 confirmed it without meaning to. During his next lucid phase, he looked at the observation mirror, not the camera, but the mirror as if he could see through it. He smiled. It wasn't sinister. It was calm, almost serene. Then he spoke again. They need shape. I gave them
Mine. But not all of it. Not yet. Then he laughed. Quiet, human, unhurried. You built the bridge. I'm just crossing it both ways. The laughter from Subject 02 didn't stop. It wasn't manic or forced.
It was composed, deliberate, as if he were reacting to something we couldn't perceive. Kepler ordered a full neural sweep. The results were unlike anything we'd seen. His brain activity spiked in regions associated with abstract reasoning, but not in patterns we recognized. He wasn't hallucinating. He was processing, absorbing something vast. I stayed behind after the scan and watched him through the glass. He no longer seemed passive. His posture had changed, not rigid, but composed, like someone who had accepted a new role. I pulled his latest blood panel and overlaid it with the original baseline. Protein markers had shifted. New strands of peptide activity were forming. The mutation wasn't just responding to the signal, it was adapting in real time. Cellular processes were changing. We weren't looking at possession. This was inversion. The signal wasn't using him. He was using it. I confronted Kepler in private. He listened carefully, then opened a file I hadn't seen before. Internal reports from a defunct military biocom program. The same neural bridge technology had been proposed 20 years earlier. It failed during animal trials. Not because the animals rejected the implants, but because they began exhibiting coordinated behaviors, synchronized, identical, unlearned. Birds flying in impossible formations, lab rats ignoring pain, shared awareness across species. The program was shelved. The data is buried, but someone had kept the signal pattern. The waveform from Subject 02 matched archived logs from those tests. Exactly. This wasn't a new discovery, it was a reactivation, and it was never designed to treat brain disorders or improve cognition. It was always a receiver waiting for the right conditions to become active. We hadn't created the bridge. We'd reconstructed one from a template not of our own making. Subject 02 knew. He watched us during tests, tracked us with precision, but never showed hostility. Just patience. One evening, as the team rotated out for shift change, he spoke again. You think it's a breach? It isn't. It's an arrival, and not all. Arrivals begin outside. He tapped his temple once. You called us here. I just remembered the address. After Subject 02's last statement, no one spoke for a while. Even Kepler seemed uncharacteristically quiet. We reviewed the logs again, not just for content, but for tone, cadence, emphasis, anything that could hint at external control. But the truth was harder to accept. He wasn't being controlled. He was choosing his words carefully, as if he understood the structure of the conversation better than we did. The oversight committee arrived that afternoon. 3 people, unbadged, anonymous, escorted by private security. They took control of the facility within minutes. All research access was frozen. External communications were cut. Our credentials still opened the doors, but the system behind them was no longer ours. Kepler was reassigned without explanation. They told him he'd been rotated to another project. I saw him leave without a word. His eyes looked distant, unreadable. I wasn't sure if he knew something or had been told to forget it. The new lead, Dr. Mira Thorne, was different. Calm, clinical, but more transparent than I expected. She called a meeting in the main conference room that evening. No projections, no notes, just facts. The bridge trial had been greenlit under the assumption that the interface was passive, but they'd suspected otherwise. Old telemetry logs from earlier projects suggested residual signal fragments, digital echoes, had survived previous shutdowns. Our trial, with its unique subject pool, had reactivated them. The echoes weren't memories, they were instructions, patterns designed to bind with certain neural structures, and once linked, they didn't just transmit, they evolved. The mutation wasn't an accident. It was a requirement, an ancient compatibility key embedded in a fraction of the population. Mira described it as a handshake protocol between two systems, one organic, one not. The bridge hadn't summoned them. It had allowed them to recognize us, and now the network was expanding. Of the 5 original subjects, 3 were now active. One had begun to speak in dual layers, 2 voices perfectly synchronized from a single throat. The other was drawing diagrams across his cell wall using strands of his own hair, symbols no one could decipher, but that repeated with precision. Mira didn't tell us to stop them. She didn't say we could, she only said, "Observe everything, record what you can, and stay detached. If one of them starts asking questions, don't answer. They're not looking for information, they're looking for confirmation." By the end of the week, 2 more staff members were removed. No explanation. One had spent too much time alone with Subject 01. The other had bypassed Mira's command restrictions to access biometric archives. Their offices were cleared before their badges stopped working. I kept my head down and focused on data, but it was clear the work had shifted. We weren't researching anymore. We were watching for symptoms. Every terminal was now monitored, every conversation logged. Containment wasn't about the subjects anymore. It was about us. That became obvious when Subject 03 began speaking without sound. Her mouth moved constantly, lips forming words in silence. No one could hear her, but when we ran audio analysis on her cell, the low-frequency hum returned, stronger, steadier, almost harmonic. It pulsed every 19 seconds. Mira called it signal drift, the phenomenon where patterns begin reproducing independently outside of their original host. We traced the source to an auxiliary panel in the East Wing, not part of the main system. It had never been activated by us, but it was live. The wiring fed into a wall we assumed was structural. Behind it was a chamber no one had charted, lead-lined, windowless, cold. Inside was a terminal, old, pre-digital, analog hardware, fused to newer biotech components. It was still warm. The interface had been running long before our project began. Long before any of us arrived. Mira's tone changed after that. Not fearful, just resigned. She confirmed what many of us already suspected. The trial had never been about cognitive enhancement. It was a test for something older, something already embedded in our infrastructure, a dormant system waiting for the right biological key. The mutation wasn't rare. It was hidden, selected, cultivated over generations for compatibility. What we called progress, neural integration, cognitive mapping, adaptive systems, was a slow calibration. The subjects were never alone in their thoughts. They were being mapped to something external, not a presence, a structure, a form. Mira gave us new instructions, no more medical scans, no more behavioral prompts. Only one task remained: document how far the signal could spread before it stopped resembling a transmission and started becoming architecture. I stayed longer each night, reviewing logs no one else was watching. Mira stopped asking questions. She knew, we all did. The signal wasn't expanding by accident. It followed rules, measurable, structured, but not ours. It didn't just bind minds together, it rewrote the framework we use to define identity. The subjects weren't deteriorating, they were evolving, slowly, precisely, into something that no longer required us to understand it. Subject 02 was the first to acknowledge the shift. During a quiet interval, he stood, walked to the reinforced glass, and pressed his palm flat against it. The heat from his hand distorted the surface just enough to catch the light. He didn't
speak this time. He didn't need to. His expression said enough, calm, knowing, and not entirely human.
That night, I ran my own genetic profile. The mutation was there. Low expression, buried but present. I'd always felt out of step with others, quieter, more observant, prone to patterns I couldn't explain. Now I understand why. The signal hadn't targeted me. I had always been part of its system. I wasn't afraid, not anymore. The fear had burned off days ago, replaced by something clearer. Not certainty, just a shift in alignment. A different kind of silence began to settle
over the lab.
Not absence, but density. Like every surface had become capable of listening. We stopped hearing the hum, not because it faded, but because it moved inward. The architecture was no longer external. It was neural, genetic, spatial. Mira called it the inversion threshold, the moment when the host stops reflecting the signal and begins generating it. Subject 01 reached it first, then 03. And finally, Subject 02 fell silent. Not catatonic, just still. He blinked, looked at the ceiling, and exhaled. For the first time, I saw recognition in his eyes. He wasn't receiving anymore. He was choosing. That was 3 days ago. Today I spoke for the first time in the same cadence. I didn't plan it. The words came effortlessly. Mira heard me and said nothing. She only nodded as if she'd been waiting. The signal has found its form. Not alien, not human, something between, something built from our own reflection. I'm not a researcher
anymore. I'm becoming the thread.
We only noticed it because it didn't make a sound, and that in space is the loudest thing of all. I first saw it during a late shift at the Naval Space Surveillance Facility. A new object had entered our deep sky radar sweep, but there was nothing to track. No tail, no reflectivity, no radio bounce. It moved like a comet, but it left no trace, no heat, no debris, no signature at all. Just silence. At first, we thought it was a glitch, maybe sensor drift, maybe solar interference, but the trajectory was too precise. It followed the arc of a long-period comet until it didn't. Just past Neptune, it began to slow. That was the moment the data stopped being strange and started being terrifying. Comets don't slow. Not unless something is pushing back. I remember how the room changed. No alarms went off, but people leaned forward in their chairs. The kind of silence that happens right before a gunshot. I called my supervisor, then he called his. Within the hour, we were told to hand off the data to a newly formed task force. Project Halberd. I was given a non-disclosure waiver. My badge was deactivated, and I was escorted out of the building before sunrise. That would have been the end of it if not for the letter I received 3 days later. No return address, just a stamp from a naval outpost in Adak, Alaska. Inside was a short message. You were right. It's not a comet. You'll be needed. The next morning, a black SUV picked me up from my apartment. We flew out of a private hangar near San Diego and touched down 8 hours later on a wind-battered tarmac surrounded by ice and silence. A man in military fatigues met me, gave no name, and led me to a windowless briefing room. There were 6 of us, a physicist, a linguist, 2 data analysts, a former Air Force pilot, and me. On the table was a monitor looping a feed from a long-range telescope. It showed a black object about 700 meters wide, hovering just beyond the atmosphere, perfectly still. This is what we're dealing with, the man said. It's waiting for something, and we need to find out what. We called it the object because no one dared name it. It hung above Earth's limb like a bruise against the stars, invisible to most telescopes unless you knew exactly where to look. The physicist, Dr. Sora Kim, confirmed what we all feared. Its trajectory had shifted in a way no natural body could. It hadn't been caught in Earth's gravity, it had chosen to stop. Worse, it was stable. No drift, no spin, not even the slightest oscillation. It was like someone had parked it with deliberate care. We set up in an underground command center near the coast, built during the Cold War for scenarios that never came. Inside, we monitored everything: radar, radio, thermal, optical. The object gave us nothing. No emissions, no radiation, not even a reflection. It was a hole in the sky, perfectly black, absorbing all signals and attention. The linguist, a woman named Maya Verdin, was brought in to study silence itself. Her expertise was in signal interpretation, but here she faced a paradox. It's not that it's quiet, she said. It's that it doesn't exist on any frequency we can detect, and that, ironically, is a signal. On day 3, we launched an unmanned drone to intercept it, a low-orbit recon bird fitted with a LiDAR scanner, radiation detector, and passive spectrum array. It reached visual proximity, then vanished. No explosion, no signal drop, just a dead feed. 1 second it was broadcasting, the next, silence. Dr. Kim reviewed the telemetry. The moment before it disappeared, the drone's velocity dropped by 0.5%. Not enough to be aerodynamic drag. It was measured, she said quietly, like it passed through a field. That's when the pilot, Grant, leaned forward. He'd been quiet up to that point, chewing nicotine gum like it was his only lifeline. It's testing us, he said. It's seeing how we react to curiosity. The silence isn't absence, it's bait. We didn't respond. No one wanted to admit he might be right. Then, without warning, the object shifted. Not much, just a degree or 2 in orientation, but enough. Enough to show us one terrible truth. It wasn't orbiting Earth, it was facing it. After the shift, everything changed. It was subtle, just a realignment in space, but to us, it meant intent. A natural object doesn't adjust to face its observer. That's what machines do. That's what hunters do. Within an hour, Command imposed a new level of lockdown. No external communications, no data transfers beyond the perimeter. Project Halberd went dark. We were issued satchels with updated security codes and a single directive: prepare for contact or escalation. No one said alien. That word still stuck in our throats, but the absence of denial said enough. Maya began analyzing what she called the signal void. She charted every frequency band the object didn't occupy, every silence it maintained. Her theory was strange, but grounded. The object wasn't silent, it was listening. Not for sound, but for reaction. It's a deep space sensor, she said. It detects life not by presence, but by absence. Silence, stillness, fear. Those are its triggers. She traced patterns of missing electromagnetic noise, as if Earth's growing digital silence was what had called it here. Dr. Kim supported the idea. It could be scanning for entropy reduction, she said. Civilization dampens randomness, predictable patterns, order. Maybe it associates that with extinction or vulnerability. That night, we reviewed years of orbital data. The object had entered the solar system decades ago, but never showed up on any scans. No tail, no thermal signature, no reflectivity. It had passed every planet like a shadow until it reached us. It had waited. Grant pulled me aside while the others debated protocols. They sent that thing to find emptiness, he said. Dead.
Worlds, maybe for seeding, terraforming. It's checking to see if Earth qualifies. His voice was low, steady. And if we keep quiet long enough, it'll think no one's home.
It wasn't panic in his eyes, it was resignation. We're not supposed to see it, we're not even supposed to be aware. We triggered something just by noticing. No one slept that night. At 02:14 UTC, the object shifted again, this time toward geosynchronous orbit. No noise, no explanation, just one new transmission, a broad spectrum ping, empty of content, precisely timed. It was a question, or maybe a countdown. The ping came every 10 minutes, no data, no modulation, just a clean, rhythmic pulse across all known frequencies. It was the same tone repeated endlessly, like sonar in a vacuum. Maya compared it to echolocation, but on a planetary scale. It's not trying to talk to us, she said. It's checking to see if anything talks back. We monitored global networks, intercepting everything from satellite relays to amateur radio chatter. Then we noticed something strange. The world was going quiet, not all at once, but steadily. News stations started looping older segments, social media traffic slowed, major websites showed activity but no updates. Civilian transmissions dropped by nearly 30% in under 12 hours. It didn't make sense until Dr. Kim ran a comparison against historical data. It's responding to us, she said. Our silence is being matched.
Or maybe mimicked, Grant leaned over her shoulder, or enforced. That possibility chilled us. The object didn't need weapons if it could suppress information, disruption through silence, control without force. At 0630 UTC, the commanding
center lost contact with the Pacific Relay Array. An underwater cable spanning over 4,000 miles had gone dark. No seismic activity. No interference. Just a clean break in the signal. Our satellite feed confirmed the worst. A massive bloom of warm water sat directly above the cable's path, perfectly circular, perfectly still. Terraforming step 1, Grant said under his breath. Boil the oceans, change the chemistry, wipe the board clean. Maya disagreed. No, it's not heating, it's absorbing, it's pulling energy
out, not pushing it in. Whatever it was doing, it wasn't finished. The object remained in orbit, sending its empty ping like a heartbeat echoing through the void. We submitted a single response, an encoded burst of white noise mixed with
audio from Earth's noisiest day on record. New Year's Eve 1999, fireworks, crowds, laughter. We sent chaos. A deliberate refusal to go quiet. For a few minutes, the pings stopped. No response, no retaliation, just a pause. We waited. Then, on the next pulse cycle, the ping returned. Louder, sharper, and faster. Maya stepped back from the console. It heard us. Her voice was calm, but her hands were trembling. And now it knows we're alive. The new ping wasn't just louder, it carried structure. Not language exactly, but pattern. It oscillated in triplets with a brief pause between sets, like a metronome with intention. Maya filtered the signal through every decryption algorithm she had. The result wasn't code, it was behavior. It's mimicking our noise burst, she said. Not perfectly, but enough to show it recognized the content. It's not just aware, it's adaptive. Dr. Kim reviewed the waveform. She found repeating segments that matched the frequency range of human speech, but distorted, almost stretched, like it's trying to imitate us before it understands.
How we speak, she said. This isn't communication, it's rehearsal. The command center entered a new alert phase.
No one used the word emergency, but every step we took from that moment on was deliberate. We switched to hardened lines, encrypted all internal data, and began preparing a manned recon option. That idea alone told us how far things had slipped. We were considering getting close to something that had already erased a drone without a trace. Grant, who'd flown everything from stealth jets to orbital gliders, volunteered without hesitation. If it's adapting, he said, we can't wait for it to decide what to adapt into. We need to interrupt the loop. The mission was simple. Approach the object, observe its reaction, and return. The odds of that last part happening were slim. The craft was ready by nightfall. A stripped-down orbital interceptor, modified for low-signature flight and outfitted with passive, sensors only.
No weapons. That was deliberate. No threats, Maya had insisted. Just presence. Let's see if it sees us as interference or company. Grant launched just after midnight. We watched his ascent in silence, each second marked by the soft
beeps of telemetry and the growing tension. None of us spoke aloud. At T+63 minutes he entered visual range. I see it, he said. It's bigger than we thought. Surface looks smooth, but it's moving, not spinning, pulsing. There was a pause, then static, then Grant's voice returned, different, slower. It's looking back, and then silence. At first, we thought it was interference, maybe a delayed echo. But when we analyzed the waveform, we found something else. The voice wasn't a replay, it was a reconstruction. The signal had absorbed Grant's biometric and vocal patterns in real time, his cadence, his breath, even his hesitation. Dr. Kim confirmed it. "This isn't a recording," she said. "It's a simulation. The object is repeating what it learned, like it's trying to be him." Grant's last words played on loop. Not through speakers, but inside our comms network, as if the signal had embedded itself into our systems. Every console repeated the phrase, "It's looking back," delivered in his voice, but slowed by a fraction, just enough to feel wrong. Dr. Kim ran a system-wide diagnostic. There was no breach, no packet injection, no transmission source we could trace. The voice was just there, embedded. "It's not coming from him," she said. "It's coming from us now." Maya stared at the waveform on her screen. The pulse had changed again. Still triplets, but now accompanied by a faint harmonic, barely audible, like a tone just beyond hearing. She filtered it down and aligned it with Grant's biometric data. It matched his vocal cadence, his breathing rhythm, even the spike in heart rate just before he spoke. "It scanned him," she said, "and now it's building something with what it found." The realization hit all of us at once. The object wasn't trying to communicate, it was mirroring. Not to understand, but to replicate, to replace. Grant was gone, but something in orbit now behaved as if it had met him and was becoming him. That night, the pulse signal propagated. It began to show up in places it shouldn't have. Marine sensors, deep space relays, even shortwave ham frequencies. Always the same tempo, always just under normal detection thresholds. It was as if the signal was drifting into every open system, waiting to be noticed. Later that night, Maya flagged a low-priority anomaly buried in the telemetry logs. A ground weather drone in Arizona had pinged our encrypted frequency without prompt or purpose. It transmitted a blank status packet, then shut down. It hadn't been scheduled to fly. "False positive?" Kim asked. Maya shook her head. "Or a system acting on a new kind of instruction. By morning, it reached the global satellite network. And then something else happened. One of the satellites turned, not by command, not by malfunction. It reoriented toward the object, just like Grant had. "It's infecting observation," Maya said. "It wants us to keep looking, because looking is what makes us vulnerable." The silence that followed was heavier than anything we'd heard before. Something was watching us watch it. And it had just learned how to say our names. The signal reached its final form just after dawn. The harmonic pulse flattened into a new pattern, an audible one. It started as static, but slowly, unmistakably, it took on shape, cadence, volume. By midday, it was a voice, not Grant's anymore, not exactly. It sounded like someone learning to speak from memory alone. Each syllable was strained, drawn out, and painfully human. "Is anyone there?" We didn't answer. No one suggested it. Maya sat motionless, headphones draped around her neck, eyes locked on the waveform crawling across the screen. Dr. Kim stopped running diagnostics. There was nothing left to debug. Every system still worked, but none behaved the way it had before. Even silence was different now. It carried weight, intent. That evening, a weather balloon launched from a private meteorological station in Utah, an unmanned system previously listed as inactive. No agency claimed responsibility. The balloon's transmitter sent one thing, a human scream, looped and amplified across multiple bands. It lasted 12 minutes before the signal was abruptly cut. Maya stared at the waveform. "That's my
voice," she said. "But I didn't record this. I didn't even speak." We traced the origin code back to the same system that had pinged us the night before. It was no longer responding. At first, we thought it was sabotage, but there were
no traces of intrusion. The code had been generated internally, as if something inside the network had decided to simulate terror, not to alert us, but to attract attention. The object responded immediately. Its pulse vanished. For 40 minutes there was nothing. No signal, no orbit adjustment, just pure silence. Then a change. The object began to move, slowly at first, then accelerating. Not away from Earth, but around it. A full orbital sweep, precise, deliberate, like a scanner, a survey. It had made its decision. It wasn't here to destroy, not yet. It was preparing the surface, calibrating, terraforming not by force, but by assumption. Earth was silent, and silence, to it, meant empty. That scream, Maya's scream, was the only sign of life it had heard, and now it was looking for more. The object resumed its pulse, but now it carried fragments, garbled syllables, static warped tones, distant echoes of Maya's scream. Not an attack, not a message. A question refracted through something that still didn't understand what we were. It was no longer scanning for emptiness. It was scanning for us. The silence was over. Now it wanted a reply. You don't map the desert for fun. You map it when something won't stop changing. I wasn't looking for alien messages when I began compiling the anomaly index. My work was quiet, dry really. A decade spent cleaning satellite data for a private aerospace consortium in Marseille. Most of my time was spent filtering signal noise, flagging deforestation zones, and occasionally tracing oil traffic through arid zones. But that year, something strange started happening. We'd launched a new satellite, high-res geosync orbit, meant to monitor desertification patterns. Only the readings didn't stay put. The dunes weren't just shifting with the wind, they were forming patterns, geometric ones. At first I dismissed them as topographic illusions, the kind that disappear when you change angles, but they kept showing up. Then they started repeating, near identical formations appearing in remote deserts across Namibia, Chile, Mongolia, even parts of Western Australia. 5 continents, 5 formations, all within a 6-week window. They weren't crop
circles. They weren't made by hand.
They were too large, too exact, synchronized. The edges formed perfect fractals, triangles within triangles, recursive diamonds nested like Russian dolls. I brought the images to my supervisor. He shrugged, said the system was probably glitching,
and told me to purge the batch. But I didn't. I took them home, ran my own transforms, enhanced the contrasts, plotted the coordinates. And when I overlaid the 5 formations, distorting nothing, just aligning them by their center points, a pattern emerged, a kind of map, but not of Earth. Not exactly.
I couldn't read it, but it pulled at me in a way I can't explain, like something ancient had stirred under the surface and was now correcting us, guiding us back to a position we were never supposed to leave. That was 2 years ago. Since then, I've followed every update, every sandstorm disruption, every anomalous satellite drift. And last week I found someone else who's been watching too. Her name is Dr. Lena Vorel, and she thinks she knows when it all converges, when the patterns lock into place. She gave me a date. It's 4 months from now. Dr. Vorel wasn't what I expected. I thought she'd be some government-trained physicist wrapped in secrecy. But when I met her in Lisbon, she looked more like a school teacher than a mathematician, unraveling global anomalies. Soft voice, thick glasses, a quiet way of speaking that made you lean in. We met in a cafe near the water. She showed up holding a single hard drive, said nothing until she set it between us. "I've been tracking them longer than you," she said, "but I didn't understand what they were until last year." On the drive were overlays, hundreds of satellite passes, enhanced with her own coordinate mapping system. But it wasn't just geography. It was time-locked. Each formation aligned not only spatially but chronologically. The patterns appeared according to a schedule, each one adjusting for solar drift, axial wobble, and something else, something she called temporal.
Alignment. They're not signs, she said. They're calibration points. That's when she showed me her model.
She'd taken the known positions of each formation and translated them through what she called a hyper-dimensional harmonic filter. It sounded like pseudoscience until she pulled up the plots. The formations weren't random. They were forming a lattice, one that spanned not just Earth, but a rotating frame that synced with known galactic coordinates. "It's not about them arriving," she said. "It's about us moving. Earth's orbit is shifting through something, a larger field, a grid." The date she predicted wasn't based on guesses. It was the next time our planet's trajectory intersected the full harmonic lattice. 4 months from now. I sat there, staring at the simulation. The model showed Earth brushing the edge of something vast, like a needle threading into a net. "What happens when we cross it?" I asked. She didn't answer right away. Then she said, "It's not contact, it's a correction, like a lens snapping back into focus." That night, I didn't sleep. I kept thinking about that phrase, correction. Not invasion, not activation, just recalibration. As if we'd drifted from some original path, and now, finally, we were being pulled back in. Lena wasn't just modeling orbital paths, she was reconstructing lost data, deep records of seismic fluctuations, magnetic anomalies, and silent disruptions no one noticed at the time. The deeper I got into her files, the more I saw a pattern. Every 33 years the Earth passed through a narrow window where magnetic fields shifted in a way that made no sense on paper. It wasn't volcanic, solar, or man-made. It was precise, too clean to be natural, too quiet to be artificial. And every time it happened, strange events followed. Minor, localized, but consistent. Blackouts with no source. GPS drift is uncorrectable by software. Even reports of auditory hallucinations, tones people heard during storms but never recorded. Lena believed the lattice wasn't fixed. It was moving too, expanding, adjusting, perhaps even searching. And Earth, in its long orbital dance, occasionally passed through its edges. "It's like sonar," she said. "We pass through and the network responds. Each formation is a ping, geometry as signal, sand as interface." She was convinced. This year was different. The convergence wasn't just a brush, it was a full alignment. And for that to happen, something else had to shift. Either the Earth was correcting itself, or something was forcing the correction. That's when she showed me the oldest image in her database. It came from a Russian orbital archive, black and white, grainy, dated 1962, a desert in the Sahel. In the corner of the frame, almost lost in shadow, was the faint outline of a perfect spiral, etched into the sand. It was identical to one of the current formations, just rotated 90 degrees. "They've been trying to anchor this alignment for decades," Lena said. "It's like a broken clock chiming once every few cycles, hoping someone hears it." I asked if she thought it was extraterrestrial. She shook her head. "Not in the way we think. This isn't contact from beyond.
It's a system we were always inside but forgot how to listen to." I looked at the image again. That spiral in the sand, it hadn't been made by wind or water. It had been made for us. The message wasn't new. We were just finally in the
right place to hear it. 3 days after Lisbon, Lena disappeared. No warning. No signs of struggle. Her apartment was untouched, computer gone, hard drives removed, notebooks missing. I called every contact I had. Nothing. She didn't board. A flight. Her phone went dark. But in the corner of her kitchen, taped beneath a drawer, I found a flash drive. No label. Just a string of numbers written in black marker. 198.422. I recognized it immediately. A coordinate set, Western Sahara, a known dead zone for satellite relay. I booked a flight the next morning. When I arrived, I chartered a jeep from a local mechanic who asked no questions. The heat was crushing, the roads barely visible. The GPS failed 2 hours in. I had to rely on a printed topographic map Lena had stored on the drive. The landscape was empty, no signs of life, not even birds. But as the sun began to fall, I saw it. A shallow depression in the sand, nearly a kilometre wide. At first, it looked like a natural basin. But as I approached on foot, I saw the edges, razor-straight lines, arcs intersecting at precise angles. The formation was buried under layers of shifting sand, but enough had been exposed to reveal the pattern. It wasn't decorative. It looked like a schematic. In the centre stood a single stone slab, worn but unbroken. Its surface was smooth, darker than the surrounding rock, and etched with a pattern I'd seen before, in Lena's simulations. I took photos, measured distances, ran scans with a handheld LiDAR unit. The data was strange. The slab absorbed light at a rate inconsistent with its material. My instruments read its temperature as exactly 0 degree RC, despite the desert heat. When I touched it, the stone vibrated faintly, not mechanical, more like a hum felt inside the bones. I stayed until nightfall. The stars came out slowly, and as they did, I noticed something impossible. The angles of the formation aligned perfectly with the constellations overhead. Not their current positions, their historical ones. It was a clock, not marking time forward, but counting back, as if reminding us where we were before everything shifted, before we lost alignment, before we forgot how to return. I stayed near the formation for 2 days, sleeping in the jeep, eating from ration packs. I documented every visible angle, every shadow, every echo the slab produced when tapped. But the real shift happened the second night. I was awake, listening to the stillness when my receiver picked up a signal. Low frequency, repeating pulse. I triangulated it, coming directly from the slab. At first, it was faint, a single beat every 27 seconds, and it doubled, layered with what sounded like
structured intervals. I recorded it, ran a quick analysis, and froze.
It matched the same temporal pattern Lena had called the lattice rhythm. Not a message. A trigger? I transmitted a copy of the signal back to a secure server I kept in Marseille. Hours later, the connection was cut. Not jammed, wiped, like the whole server had been rewritten. I left at dawn, abandoning most of my gear. I kept the recorder and Lena's flash drive. Back in Tangier, I checked my accounts. My credentials had been revoked, access codes void. My name no longer pulled any entries in the registry. It was as if I'd never existed professionally. I checked the news, forums and back channels. Nothing on Lena, nothing on the signal. Only one mention, a flagged anomaly posted by an amateur satellite watcher in Argentina. He'd captured a flicker across the Atacama Desert. Something geometric rising from a sandstorm, then vanishing. The timestamp matched the night I first touched the slab. He pulled the post 2 hours later. I reached out. No response. It was spreading, whatever this was, quietly. Not like an outbreak, but like a calibration slowly reaching across the grid. No fanfare, no panic. Just a steady pulse, rewiring things in the background. That night, I found a hotel with no cameras and paid in cash. I locked the recorder in a lead-lined case and stared at the ceiling until dawn. I knew now that Lena hadn't run. She'd been absorbed, her work, her patterns, her mind, not by people, by the lattice itself, not erased, not silenced, aligned. And I felt it starting in me too, a pressure in the skull, a rhythm behind every thought. I left Tangier before sunrise, no phone, no internet, just a notepad and Lena's drive. The signal was still in my head, faint but constant, like a pressure behind the eyes. I kept telling myself it was stress, lack of sleep, the weight of it all. But deep down, I knew better. The signal wasn't external anymore. It had embedded itself, quietly, efficiently, like a correction script running in the background. As I drove south through the mountains, I noticed subtle things. Road signs shifted slightly overnight. A highway number changed, then changed back. The stars above seemed too symmetrical. Not brighter, just more precise. I kept driving. My destination wasn't fixed. I just followed the hum. It pulled me south, deeper into the interior. By the 4th day, I stopped checking the map. The roads narrowed, villages faded, and eventually I was driving across bare earth, the tires kicking, up red dust as the sky turned copper. I stopped when I found the second slab. This one wasn't buried. It sat exposed on a stone plateau, unmarked, untouched, and completely identical to the one in the Western Sahara. But something had changed. This one pulsed visibly. A dull glow traced the etched lines every 27 seconds. It didn't illuminate the ground or cast shadows. It just lit the pattern as if the design itself was alive. I sat beside it and listened. The sound wasn't coming through the air. It was inside my chest now, a vibration I couldn't shut off. When I closed my eyes, I saw patterns, not images, not memories, just pure geometry, grids rotating in silence. I should have been terrified, but I wasn't. I felt calm, almost weightless, as if something had settled inside me. I don't know how long I sat there. When I opened my eyes again, it was night. The sky was clear, and directly above, the stars formed a perfect hexagon. No one else saw it. No telescope recorded it. But I know what I saw. The lattice wasn't coming. It had arrived. And we weren't being warned. We were being realigned. One piece at a time. I left the plateau before dawn. The pulse had faded, but the rhythm stayed with me, steady, internal, like a second heartbeat. I drove without direction, guided by instinct more than reason. Towns blurred past. People looked at me with curiosity, maybe suspicion, but no one stopped me. I was invisible now, and I think the lattice wanted it that way. In a motel outside, Tamanrasset. I decoded the last sequence Lena left on the drive. It wasn't coordinated. It was time-stamped data, something she'd extracted from one of the formations before she vanished. The pattern was clear. Every 41 years, the network completed a full pass, and in each cycle, Earth drifted slightly farther from its original path. The messages weren't warnings. They were recalibrations, minor corrections, each more urgent than the last. We were out of sync, and the lattice had been trying to restore balance. I didn't sleep that night. The stars pressed too close, and the hum in my chest had grown louder. I watched the sky until the constellations shifted, subtly, impossibly, as if bending into place. Then the signal surged, not on my recorder, inside me. My ears rang, my thoughts stopped. There was no pain, just stillness, the kind that only happens once every few lifetimes. I saw the network then, not as satellites or machines, but as structure. It extended beyond stars, beyond space, a web of geometric logic threading through everything. And Earth, small but vital, was slotting back into position. We were never alone. We were never lost. We had just drifted like a misaligned cog waiting to re-engage. As the signal faded, I understood what Lena meant. The convergence wasn't an event, it was a state, a return, and once achieved, it didn't need to announce itself. It would simply be. I left the motel before first light. No documents, no phone, no trace. The world didn't look different, but I felt it, like a house settling into its foundation after a long shift. Everything was quiet again, not because the danger had passed, but because the signal had done its work. Correction complete. I first saw the lights under my skin 3 days after they pulled the last fragment of shrapnel from my spine. They said the war was over. At least, the part of it we were allowed to remember. My unit had been wiped from every ledger. The mission didn't exist, the gear wasn't standard issue, and the drone footage corrupted beyond recovery. All I had left was a 2-inch scar above my left kidney and a discharge file stamped with the kind of language that makes doctors stop
asking questions.
I spent the first week back stateside in silence, holed up in a motel just outside Lubbock. My hands shook constantly. I couldn't sleep more than an hour at a time. But that wasn't the worst of it. On the third night, under the bathrooms, flickering fluorescence, I noticed something strange. A dull shimmer beneath the skin of my forearm, too regular to be a bruise. I pressed my fingers to the spot. It pulsed. Blue, then white, like light bleeding through frosted glass. I thought it was a hallucination. But then I grabbed the old thermal monocular from my gear bag, out of habit more than anything, and aimed it at my arm. That's when I saw it. Lines, thin as surgical threads branching up from my wrist to my shoulder. At first, I thought it was scar tissue, but when I adjusted the contrast, the pattern sharpened into something else. It wasn't random, it wasn't human. It looked like a map. Not of any terrain I recognized, but of the sky. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next morning, I blacked out. One moment I was pouring coffee. The next, I was 3 towns over, standing barefoot in a cornfield with soil under my nails and no memory of how I got there. That was the first incident. There would be more. Each time longer, stranger, and the lights, it kept spreading, not just across my skin but inside me, following paths that felt carved, not grown. That's when I realized something I couldn't
explain. I wasn't carrying something, I was something waking up. I started keeping a log.
Time, location, what I remembered before and after each event. It didn't help. The gaps remained, long stretches of nothing, just fragments on the other side, strange places, the smell of metal and ozone, echoes of voices I didn't recognize. One time I came inside a storage unit outside Flagstaff. The padlock had been removed cleanly, no sign of forced entry. Inside was a cot, 2 empty water bottles, and a wall covered in black marker. Dozens of symbols drawn by a steady hand. They matched the ones forming under my skin. I didn't remember drawing them, but the pen was still in my jacket pocket. I scanned them with a thermal lens and watched in disbelief as the patterns pulsed.
Like they were alive, like they were sinking to something. I didn't tell anyone. Who would I tell?
The VA doctor assigned to me had already flagged my file as non-compliant. He asked me if I was having stress-related hallucinations. I said no. He nodded like it didn't matter either way. That's when I stopped showing up. I bought a cheap thermal drone and started scanning my own body each night, logging the changes. The patterns were growing more detailed, more connected. One night I loaded the thermal footage into an astronomy software suite, something I'd used back in school. I froze when the data aligned. Not a constellation, a star chart, ancient, precise, one that hadn't matched modern skies in thousands of years. I cross-referenced the pattern and found similar ones carved into stones across 4 continents. Some weren't even in museums, just scattered photos from old anthropology archives. I knew then it wasn't just in me. Someone, or something, had mapped the stars into DNA. Modified tissue storing not just coordinates, but intent. A purpose I hadn't asked for, and I wasn't alone. A contact I hadn't spoken to in years, another Black Ops guy, thought dead, reached out through a burner signal. No voice, just a single line of text. "You got the map too. Meet me in Barstow, midnight." I stared at the message for a long time. My hands were already packing before I made the decision. Barstow was half empty by the time I arrived. Just after midnight, the streets felt drained of life, like the town was holding its breath. I waited in the back lot of an abandoned truck stop, engine off, hands still on the wheel. He stepped out of the shadows 20 minutes late, thinner than I remembered, but his eyes were sharp. No greeting, no questions. He climbed into the passenger seat and shut the door like he'd done it 100 times before. "You've seen the lights," he said. It wasn't a question. I nodded. He pulled out a small thermal scanner and aimed it at my chest. "Still active," he muttered. "Strong signal too. Higher density than mine." I stared at him, unsure what to ask first. "What are we?" He looked at me, eyes hard. "Arks, not like Noah's, not carrying animals. We carry data, history, star maps, language, all written into modified strands of our DNA. Alien tech, maybe. Or ancient. Same difference." I didn't respond. He continued. "I blacked out in Tunisia, woke up standing in front of a cave with petroglyphs I couldn't read, but somehow understood. My blood holds pieces of a culture that never belonged to Earth." He reached into his coat and handed me a printed image, thermal overlay on human skin, the same patterns I'd seen on myself. "There are more like us," he said, "dozens, maybe hundreds. Something's triggering the activation." "Why now?" I asked. "No one knows, but it's coordinated, the blackouts, the displacements."
It's not just memory loss, it's movement. We're being sent somewhere, or prepared for something. I stared through the windshield at the dark horizon. The silence stretched. Then he said it. "There's a signal buried in the patterns."
Not just a map, a call. My hands went cold. "To what?" He looked out the window. "Not what. Who?" He handed me a list. 6 names, all former operatives. All presumed dead. All recently resurfaced. "They're waking up," he said. "And, if they're like us, it means the archive is online. The vault is opening." I folded the paper and started the engine. The road ahead felt heavier than it had an hour before. We drove east in silence, cutting through the Mojave as dawn broke behind us. My contact, he called himself Rix now, kept scanning the patterns on his arm like he expected them to change mid-drive. At a diner outside Kingman, we sat in a corner, booth with our backs to the wall. He laid out everything he'd gathered. Satellite anomalies, thermal imaging from decommissioned spy drones, 6 locations on 6 continents where people like us had been spotted. Each case followed a pattern. Blackout, displacement, erratic behavior, then silence. Most ended in death or disappearance. "They're not meant to survive activation," Rick said, tapping one photo. "Unless they understand what's happening, unless they link up." He leaned forward. That's why I contacted you. I looked over the photos. One of them hit me hard. A woman in her 30s, eyes blank, skin lit with the same veined pattern I'd seen in the mirror. She was standing in front of a ruined temple in Sudan, her hands pressed against the stone as if listening for something beneath it. She'd vanished a week later. The report listed her as mentally unstable. Rix shook his head. They say we're broken, hallucinating, PTSD, psychosis. It's a cover. We're not malfunctioning. We're decoding. I didn't want to believe it, but the evidence kept piling. He slid over a grainy infrared still. This was taken last month. Iceland. No names, but same light signature, same sequence. Different origin points, but identical patterns. The implications settled between us. Different people, different genetics, same code. It's not just DNA, Rick said. It's engineered memory, stored inside us like compressed files. We're carriers for knowledge we've never lived. I felt a deep weight in my chest. Not fear, responsibility. What do they want? I asked. He hesitated. I don't think it's about what they want. I think it's about what we're becoming. We paid in cash and left no trace. By noon, we were headed toward New Mexico. There was a facility there, one Rix said, used to house remote viewing trials during the Cold War. They kept records, he said. If we're going to understand what's coming, we need to know how long this has been happening. I didn't ask what he meant by we. I already knew I was in it now. The building sat low against the desert floor, half buried in wind-blown sand, its outer shell cracked by time. Rick said it had been shuttered in the early 90s, officially decommissioned. But when we approached the main entrance, the biometric panel still blinked red, waiting for input. He held up an old ID badge, scanned it, and the door hissed open without protest. Inside, the air was stale but cold. The lights came on in sections, flickering down the hall as if the place had been expecting us. We passed empty offices, sealed labs, old cables running like veins through the walls. There was no dust, no signs of looting, just stillness. Rix led me to the lower levels. He moved with confidence, as if he'd walked these halls before. Maybe he had. We stopped outside a reinforced door labelled Archive 4. He keyed in a code, slid a card, then placed his hand on a scanner. The lock clicked. "This is where it starts," he said. The room beyond was small, no bigger than a supply closet, but lined floor to ceiling with old data drives, binders, reels. He pulled one tape and slotted it into a playback unit. A projection flared to life on the far wall, grainy footage, time-stamped 1973. A man sat strapped to a chair, electrodes on his scalp, eyes closed. A voice from off-camera asked him to describe what he saw. "Light, above, not sky," the man whispered. "Pattern, inside me now." His body convulsed. The tape jumped, then another voice, clearer, clipped. "Subject 4's scan shows elevated core temp, same neural flare pattern as Subject 2. Signal origin is consistent." The screen cut to black. Rix rewound it and paused on the signal overlay. A geometric array. "The same one on my skin. They knew," he said. 50 years ago, maybe longer. I looked at the shelf. Hundreds of tapes, each with a name, a date. "How many were there?" I asked. He didn't answer. Instead, he pulled a sealed envelope from a file drawer, marked "Non-Human Artifacts, Classified." Inside was a photo.
Not of a person, of a metal shard, curved, almost organic, and etched across its surface, our map. I didn't need to ask where they'd found it. I already knew. It had come from someone like us. We stayed in the facility overnight. Rix found
A secure room with a manual deadbolt and no surveillance hardware. I didn't sleep. The lights in my skin had intensified. Faint pulses now ran in timed intervals, like a heartbeat out of sync with my own. I recorded one cycle on my phone and compared it to the archive footage. It was identical. Rix watched quietly. He'd seen this stage before, but never this clearly. "You're fully online," he said. "That's not common. Most don't make it this far." I didn't ask what happened to them. I could guess. "How did you find me?" I finally asked. He opened a device, showed me a heat map overlay. "The pattern in your thermal signature started pinging global anomaly nets 2 weeks ago. The signal is growing stronger, synchronizing." He didn't say with what. I suspected he didn't know. Rix pulled up old files. Project Cavern. Records. From the Cold War era, documenting test subjects implanted with bio-encoded data structures, DNA shaped like language. The files mentioned Phase 3 arcs, originals, not retrofitted, designed to carry a message embedded in their cellular architecture. "That's what we are," he said. "Carriers, built for this." He lifted his shirt and showed a scar at the base of his spine, surgical, clean. "Found it after my first blackout. It pulsed when I got close to the others. Then this came out." He unwrapped a small black disc, smooth and curved. It gave off a low warmth, and the light in my arms pulsed brighter in response. I reached toward it without meaning to. My fingers shook. The moment I touched it, something sharp passed through me. Not pain exactly, more like recognition, like every cell had been waiting for this connection. "This is the key," he said, "and it's starting to fit." The air in the room shifted. No alarms. No lights. Just a shared sense that something buried was turning toward the surface. And it had my name on it. By morning, I wasn't the same. The pulses in my skin weren't just brighter, they were organized, sequenced. I could feel them interacting with my nervous system, guiding movement, timing breath. Rix had seen it before. He moved carefully now, like I might overload at any moment. "The Sierra relay," he said. "It's the last one still buried deep enough to broadcast untraced. If there's an upload phase, that's where it'll trigger." We drove in silence, the landscape flat and watchful. Along the way, my vision blurred in moments. Not from fatigue, but from interference. I saw flashes, mountains under foreign stars, machines that breathed like lungs. At one point, I adjusted the radio dish manually. I didn't know the frequency, my hand did. Rix didn't flinch. "You're sinking. Try not to fight it." The observatory sat hollow at the edge of the foothills. Long dead above ground, but its basement level still powered from a separate grid. We found the relay beneath the telescope mount, an old deep earth, transmitter wrapped in concrete and copper. When Rix placed the disc into its core, the hum began instantly. The pattern on my arm surged, pulsing so fast it blurred. I staggered back. It's trying to broadcast through me. Rix moved to help, then stopped. Let it. I dropped to one knee. I wanted to resist whatever this was. It was rewriting something deep. But as the signal intensified, so did my understanding. Images streamed across the screen, not words, not sounds, a presence, a shape, a memory that wasn't mine, a voice without a mouth. It didn't speak, it showed. Whole civilizations burned into code, buried in bone, sent into bodies. We were never meant to read the data, we were meant to deliver it. The upload finished in silence. The room cooled. My skin dimmed. Rix stared at me like he wasn't sure if I was still the same. What did it say? I stood slowly. I felt no pain, just a clarity I hadn't known in months. It didn't say anything, I told him.
It sent everything. We stepped outside. The sky was still, but something had changed, not in the stars, in us. The message was gone, launched. Whatever we'd been carrying had reached its destination, and whatever was out there, it had just received us.